3 minutes. That was all Nolan Bishop had left before the interview that could change his life. His phone buzzed against his palm. Ashworth Industries, confirming the time. He silenced it without looking. Across the street, an elderly woman crumpled onto the sidewalk, and nobody stopped walking. Nolan ran. He caught her before her head hit the concrete, and as her eyes fluttered open, her fingers closed around his wrist. She murmured a name he had never heard before. Behind him, the glass doors of the interview office swung shut. 9 o'clock came and went, and no one inside ever knew his name. The coffee shop on Larimer Street smelled like burnt espresso and rain. Nolan eased the old woman into a chair by the window and crouched in front of her, checking her pulse the way he'd learned years ago, back when steady hands had meant something different. She was pale but breathing fine, more shaken than hurt. He flagged down the barista for water and asked the woman her name. "Margaret," she said, and then, after a pause that lasted a beat too long, "I think I was going somewhere. I can't recall where." "That's all right," Nolan said. "We'll figure it out." He didn't ask what brought a woman like her coat too fine for the block, a driver somewhere she couldn't name, onto a sidewalk alone. He just called a cab, gave the dispatcher the cross streets, and sat with her until the car pulled up. On her wrist, half hidden under her sleeve, a thin gold bracelet caught the light, engraved along the inside. Ashworth. Nolan didn't see it. He was checking his own phone, watching the missed call from Human Resources blink red across the screen. His phone rang again before the cab left the curb. Milo's name lit up the display, and something in Nolan's chest loosened just from seeing it. "Hey, bud." "Dad, are you coming to get me early?" "Coach said practice ends at 4. I'll be there," Nolan said. "Promise." "Did you get the job?" Nolan watched Margaret's cab merge into traffic, taillights disappearing around the corner. "We'll talk about it tonight, okay? Go have fun." "Okay. Love you, Dad." "Love you too, kid." He called the recruiter next, already knowing what she'd say. The line picked up on the second ring, brisk and apologetic in the practiced way people get when they've said the same words to a dozen other men that week. The 9 o'clock slot had closed. There wouldn't be another opening until next quarter, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Nolan thanked her anyway, because there was nothing else to do, and stood on the sidewalk a long moment after the call ended, the cold working its way up through his jacket. He thought about the invoice due Friday, the furnace parts he still owed the supplier for, the look Milo got sometimes when he thought his father wasn't watching, like he was doing math on things an 8-year-old shouldn't have to calculate. Then he thought about Margaret's hand gripping his wrist, and the way her voice had cracked when she said thank you, and he found he didn't regret it. Not really. Not enough to matter. By the time he picked Milo up from the school gym, he'd folded the whole afternoon into something small enough to carry. "So, the interview?" Milo asked, backpack already half off one shoulder as he climbed into the truck. "Didn't happen," Nolan said. "I helped somebody who needed it more." Milo considered this with the seriousness only a child gives to simple things. Was it worth it? Nolan pulled out onto the road, streetlights just starting to flicker on against the dimming sky. "Yeah," he said, and meant it. "I think it was." He didn't mention the woman's name. He didn't know yet that it would matter. He just drove home with his son beside him, already rehearsing which bills he'd juggle this month and which he'd let wait, the way he always did, the way he'd gotten good at doing alone. Camille Ashworth had been in board meetings that felt less dangerous than the 2 hours after her mother went missing. It started with a call from Teresa Byrne, calm on the surface, urgency running underneath it like a current. Margaret had gone for her usual walk near the Highland house and hadn't come back. Teresa had checked the block twice, called twice, and only phoned Camille when the second hour bled into a third. By the time Camille reached the house, her hands weren't shaking, but her voice was clipped, controlled, the voice she used when a deal was collapsing, and everyone in the room needed her to sound like it wasn't. "She's done this before," Teresa said, twisting a dish towel in her hands. "Never this long." "You called the police?" "An hour ago. They're looking." I thought I could find her faster." Camille didn't waste time on blame. She pulled up the security feed from the Block Association's cameras, cycling through footage frame by frame, jaw tight, waiting for a flash of her mother's coat among strangers who didn't know what they were looking at. It took 40 minutes to find her. 40 minutes of grainy sidewalks and delivery trucks and nothing. And then there, Margaret, unsteady, going down near a crosswalk on Larimer, and a man crossing against the light to catch her before she fell. Camille watched the clip 11 times. The man's face was mostly turned from the camera, jacket worn soft at the elbows. Nothing about him that should have held her attention, but something in the way he checked her mother's pulse, unhurried, sure of his hands, made her rewind it a 12th time. "Do we know him?" she asked. Teresa didn't. Neither did security. It was Camille's assistant, Priya, who found it not looking for the man at all, just pulling old project files while Camille worked the phones, trying to trace the cab company that had picked Margaret up. "This is strange," Priya said, half to herself, scrolling through a personnel archive from 6 years back. "There's a name flagged in the original site engineering file for the tower, lead structural engineer. Left the company right after the Platte River accident." "What accident?" "Before your time on the board. Scaffolding collapse at a satellite site. 1 fatality." Priya squinted at the screen. "Name's Bishop. Nolan Bishop." Camille went still. She pulled the security clip back up, froze it on the one clear angle of the man's face, and set it beside the 6-year-old employee photo Priya found in the archive. Same jaw, same eyes, older now, tired in a way the photo hadn't shown yet. The man who'd saved her mother's life had once built the ground her company's tower stood on. She didn't tell Teresa what she'd found. She didn't tell the board, didn't tell anyone. She got the address from the cab company's manifest, a modest house on the north side. Nothing that matched the man in the old file. A senior engineer who should have had a corner office and a pension by now. She told herself she was only going to say thank you. She drove there that evening, a small box of pastries from the bakery near her office sitting untouched on the passenger seat, rehearsing words that all sounded wrong. She parked across the street and sat for a moment before getting out, the porch light already on, warm and low. Through the front window, she could see a boy 7 or 8, maybe setting the table for 2, laughing at something only he could hear. A man's jacket hung over the back of a kitchen chair, the same worn elbows from the footage. Camille's hand stopped on the car door handle. This wasn't a stranger who happened to be kind. This was a man with a whole life built around a boy who didn't know his father had once designed the bones of the tallest building in the city, and lost it all, and never said a word. She sat there another full minute before she made herself get out of the car. Nolan opened the door expecting a delivery. Instead, he found a woman standing on his porch with a bakery box balanced against her hip, looking like she'd talked herself into this twice and out of it once. "Mr. Bishop, that's me. My name is Camille. I believe you helped a woman near Larimer Street yesterday." "Margaret." She held up the box like an offering. "She's my mother. I wanted to thank you properly." Nolan's shoulders eased, some tension leaving them he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Is she all right?" "Shaken. Nothing broken. She wanders sometimes." Camille hesitated on the word, like it cost her something to say it to a stranger. "You didn't have to stay with her. Wasn't going to leave her on the sidewalk." He invited her in without thinking too hard about it, the way you do when a person's gratitude feels heavier than their politeness. Milo appeared in the kitchen doorway, curious in the unfiltered way of children, and introduced himself before Nolan could stop him. "Are you the lady from the news?" Milo asked. "Dad said somebody rich lives in a mansion like the ones on TV." "Milo." "It's fine," Camille said, and something in her face loosened, just slightly, at the boy's bluntness. "I don't think I'm on the news. My dad used to draw buildings," Milo said, unprompted, already moving on to what interested him more. "Big ones. Before Mom died. He doesn't do it anymore, but he's got old drawings in a box in the garage. I found them once." "Milo, go finish your homework," Nolan said, gentler than the words suggested, and the boy shrugged and wandered off, already forgetting he'd said anything worth remembering. Camille filed it away without comment. She didn't ask what kind of buildings, or why a man who once drew them now smelled faintly of refrigerant and solder. She only said, "He's a good kid. He's the best thing I've got," Nolan said. And it wasn't a deflection so much as the truth. Margaret came in from the sitting room, moving slower than she had on the sidewalk, steadied by a cane Camille didn't remember her needing a month ago. She looked at Nolan, and her face changed soft, sudden, lit with a recognition that didn't quite belong to this room. "Robert," she said, "you're late for supper again." Camille's breath caught. "Mom, this is Nolan. He's the one who helped you yesterday." Margaret blinked, the fog passing but not quite clearing. Of course, she said, recovering with the practiced grace of someone used to covering these gaps. Nolan, thank you for walking me home. Nolan didn't correct anything, didn't ask who Robert was. He just pulled out a chair for her, unhurried, like this was a normal Tuesday, and not a woman losing pieces of herself in real time in front of her daughter. Camille watched him do it, and felt something shift, quiet and unannounced. Before she left, she extended an invitation: come by the office this week. Let the company thank him properly. Nothing more than that. She didn't say which company. She didn't need to. Nolan didn't ask. Outside, in the driveway, a car idled at the curb longer than it should have. A man in his 30s leaned against it, watching the house with the particular stillness of someone waiting for a reason to approach. When Milo wandered out to grab the mail, the man crossed toward him with an easy smile. "Hey kid, you're Nolan's boy, right? I'm Corey, your mom's brother." He crouched slightly, voice light. "Your dad got a new job or something? Heard he's been over at some big office downtown." Milo shrugged, mail in hand. "I don't know. Grown-up stuff." Sure. Corey straightened, glancing once at the house before turning back to his car. "Tell him I said hi." He was gone before Nolan came looking for the boy, and neither of them thought to mention it. The tower rose 52 stories over downtown Denver, glass catching the morning light in a way that made Nolan stop on the sidewalk before he even reached the entrance. He knew this building, not from photographs, not from driving past it 100 times without looking up. He knew the weight of its foundation the way a man knows the sound of his own heartbeat. He had signed off on those load calculations himself, 6 years and a lifetime ago. His hands were steady walking through the lobby. His chest wasn't. He gave his name at the front desk and waited, watching people move through a building he'd once known from the bedrock up, none of them aware that the man standing quietly by the elevators had built the floor they stood on. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a man in his 50s. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of authority that came from real position rather than borrowed confidence. His badge read Julian Sterling, Chief Operating Officer. "I'm here to see Miss Ashworth." Sterling's gaze moved over Nolan once, cataloging him, the jacket, the boots, the hands, and finding him wanting. "This floor requires clearance." "He's my guest, Julian." Camille's voice cut through before Sterling could press further. She'd arrived from the elevator bank, composed in the way she always was for this building, and something eased in her posture at the sight of Nolan, though she didn't let it show on her face. "Mr. Bishop helped my mother last week." "How generous of him," Sterling said, in a tone that suggested the opposite, and excused himself toward the boardroom without waiting for a reply. Camille led Nolan toward her office, apologizing without quite apologizing. "He's protective of the building. Ignore him." Nolan said nothing, but his eyes moved along the lobby's support columns, the sight lines, the places where a structure either held or didn't. Camille noticed the way he read the space, like he was checking its bones instead of admiring its finish, and filed that away too, alongside the drawings in the garage and the boy who mentioned them without knowing what he'd given away. She didn't ask him outright. Rule 4 of her own making, unspoken but absolute. This building had no room for a man's whole history spilled out over gratitude and coffee. Whatever he was hiding, he'd tell her when he was ready, or he wouldn't, and either way she wasn't going to corner him for it. Inside the boardroom down the hall, the real business of the morning waited. Sterling stood at the head of the table, laying out a partnership proposal with the Whitfield family. Old money, older influence, the kind of alliance that came wrapped in language about stability and shareholder confidence but meant something much simpler underneath. A formal union between the families would settle every question the market has about this company's future, Sterling said. "Yours included, Camille. I run this company. That hasn't been in question. Perception is a currency, same as revenue." Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The Whitfield son is amenable. It would be a clean arrangement." Margaret, seated at the far end of the table in the honorary chair she still held as a founding shareholder, set down her water glass hard enough to draw every eye in the room. "My daughter is not a merger clause," she said, voice thin but unmistakably clear. "I built half of what's in this room with my husband, and I will not sit here and watch you barter away his granddaughter like a parcel of land." Sterling's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, and the meeting moved on to numbers that mattered less. Camille found Nolan afterward in the hallway, offered him lunch in the executive dining room, and watched him decline with an ease that didn't quite mask the hurry underneath it. "I've got a job across town," he said, "but thank you for everything." He left before she could ask what job, and she let him go, because some questions were better earned than asked. The service call came through Nolan's business line on a Tuesday commercial HVAC unit, floor 31, Ashworth Tower. He almost turned it down, out of some instinct he couldn't name, then took it anyway, because the invoice from the supplier hadn't gotten any smaller. He didn't know Teresa Byrne had made the call herself, using a maintenance contact she'd kept from her years working odd jobs before Margaret hired her, quietly steering the request toward a man whose hands, she'd noticed, moved like someone who understood buildings from the inside out. Nolan spent 3 days in that tower fixing a system that, once he got into the guts of it, told him more about the building's original bones than any blueprint could. He recognized the duct routing. He recognized his own decisions, made half a decade ago by a younger version of himself, who still believed the ground under a building was the one thing you could trust completely. Camille found reasons to pass through that floor more than her schedule required. Their conversations stayed short: work, weather, Milo's latest science project, Margaret's good days and bad ones, but they lengthened by degrees, the way trust does when neither person forces it. Neither of them mentioned what the other did before this. He never asked what her title actually was on the building directory. She never asked why a man who fixed air conditioners read a support column like a page of scripture. It was a fragile agreement, unspoken and mutual, and it let something grow in the space where explanations would have gone instead. On Saturday, Milo and Margaret ended up at the same park bench near the Highland House, an accident of timing that stopped feeling accidental after the 3rd week. Margaret taught him how to feed the ducks without letting them nip at his fingers. Milo taught her the rules of a card game he'd invented that made no sense and delighted her anyway. They sat close together on the bench, an old woman and a young boy who'd found something steady in each other that neither of their families had planned. It was on one of those Saturdays that Corey Lane found Nolan alone in the parking lot, waiting for Milo. "Heard you're doing pretty well for yourself," Corey said. No preamble. "Big office building. Nice for a guy still driving that truck." "What do you want, Corey?" "You know what happened out at Platte River? What that company did to my sister?" Corey's voice tightened around old grief that had curdled into something uglier. "They owe this family. You're standing right there in their building every day, and you haven't said one word." "That's not on the table." "Maybe it should be. I could make a call to somebody who'd love a story about the engineer they blamed for a woman's death, sneaking back into the company that buried her. See how good that looks for them." Corey's threat came out thin, more desperate than dangerous, and Nolan heard the difference even as his stomach dropped at the mention of a reporter. "You do that," Nolan said quietly, "and Milo hears about his mother's death from a headline instead of from me. Is that really what you want?" Corey didn't answer. He got back in his car and drove off, and Nolan stood in the lot a long moment before Milo came running out, oblivious, backpack bouncing, asking what was for dinner. That same afternoon, in a back room of the Highland House, Teresa sorted through a box of Margaret's old paperwork, the kind of task that filled quiet hours and kept her hands busy while her mind worried over things she couldn't fix. Margaret had kept a home file of company matters for decades, back when she still sat on internal committees before her memory began to slip, and nobody had ever thought to clean it out. Buried beneath insurance documents and old holiday cards, Teresa found a manila folder she didn't remember filing. "Platte River Site Internal Review," the label read, and beneath it, a name she recognized now from every conversation in this house for the past month. Bishop N. Teresa closed the folder slowly, glanced toward the hallway to make sure she was alone, and slid it to the back of the closet shelf. Unsure yet what it meant, only certain that it mattered and that she wasn't ready to hand it to anyone. Camille heard it by accident, the way most true things get heard. She'd come to Sterling's floor to drop off a signed contract and paused outside his half-open office door when she caught the edge of his voice, low and tight, the tone he used when he thought no one who mattered was listening. "The Platte River file needs to stay sealed. Permanently. If it surfaces again, it doesn't just cost us money, it costs us the whole tower's safety record." A pause. "I don't care how old it is. Handle it." Camille didn't go in. She walked back to her office, sat with the closed door for 10 minutes, and then did something she hadn't done in years. She called Teresa directly. Not about Margaret, but about the past. I need to ask you something, Camille said. Have you ever heard the name Platte River in this house? Anything about an old accident? The silence on the line went on a beat too long. Come by tonight, Teresa said. I have something I probably should have shown you weeks ago. That evening, in the same back room where she'd found it, Teresa laid the folder open on the kitchen table between them. Camille read through it twice, her hands going cold by the second pass. The report detailed a scaffolding collapse at a satellite construction site 6 years earlier, a safety violation flagged and then quietly buried, a signature on the final inspection sign-off that cleared the site for continued work despite an unresolved structural concern. One fatality. A woman named Anna Bishop, wife of the site's lead structural engineer. Sterling's name isn't on it, Camille said. Look again. Bottom corner. There's an internal memo stapled behind the report. Teresa's voice was careful. I called an old contact of mine, retired inspector, worked the case at the time. He remembered it because it never sat right with him. He said the signature on that sign-off wasn't the engineer's. Somebody forged it to make it look like Bishop cleared his own site as safe, when he'd actually flagged it as dangerous 3 separate times before the collapse. Camille sat back, the pieces reorganizing themselves into a shape she didn't want to see. The man who fixed her mother's stumble on a sidewalk, who read a building's bones without being asked, who never once mentioned the wife his son barely remembered. He hadn't just lost everything at Ashworth Industries. He'd been blamed for it, buried under a signature that wasn't his. And the man burying it further, even now, worked 3 floors above her office. She thought of the way Nolan had stood in her lobby that first day, reading the columns instead of admiring them, saying nothing about what he saw. She thought of Milo mentioning the drawings in the garage, as if they were nothing more than an old man's forgotten hobby. All of it rearranged itself now into a shape that made her chest ache. He never said anything, Camille murmured. Not one word, all this time. Would you have believed him 6 years ago, against a signed report? Teresa asked. Not unkindly. Camille didn't answer that. She folded the papers back into the manila envelope with hands that had gone steady again, the way they always did once she'd decided something. I need more before I take this anywhere, she said. If Sterling finds out what we have, he'll burn what's left of it before the board ever sees it. She left that night with the folder locked in her car, already running through who else might have handled that file. Who else might remember, and how much time she had before someone noticed it was missing. The private meeting Camille called with Sterling the next morning went exactly as badly as she expected. She laid out what she had: the memo, the retired inspector's account, the timeline that didn't match the official record, and watched Sterling's face rearrange itself into practiced calm. That inspector's a bitter old man with a grudge against this company, Sterling said. You're building a case on hearsay. I'm building a case on a forged signature, Julian. Prove it then. In the meantime, understand something. He leaned forward, voice dropping into something colder. The Whitfield Alliance isn't a suggestion anymore. I have 4 board members ready to vote no confidence if you keep chasing ghosts instead of running this company. Choose your fights, Camille. She left the meeting with nothing resolved, and everything confirmed. That same evening, Corey Lane made the call he'd been threatening for weeks, reaching a local reporter with a half-formed story about a disgraced engineer working his way back into the company that buried him. He got as far as a name and a headline suggestion before something in his own chest stopped him. Not conscience exactly, not yet, but hesitation, the kind that comes when a bluff starts to feel like it might actually land somewhere it shouldn't. He hung up before the reporter called back, and drove to Nolan's house instead, showing up on the porch for the second time that month. I need you to hear me out, Nolan said, before Corey could open with a threat. Anna wouldn't want this. Not you dragging her name through a tabloid to shake money out of a company. She'd want the truth, clean, not a headline that gets forgotten in a week. The truth hasn't done either of us any good in 6 years. It's about to, Nolan said, quiet enough that Corey actually listened. Give me a little more time. Corey left without agreeing to anything, but he also left without making the call, and that was as close to trust as the two of them had managed since Anna died. Inside, Nolan found Camille waiting near his truck, having come by unannounced to ask what he knew about an old accident everyone at Ashworth suddenly seemed too careful discussing. Neither of them said what they were really circling. You read that building like it's a person, she said instead, watching him from a careful distance. like you already know all its secrets. Maybe I just notice things. Maybe, she said, and let it go, though something in her eyes said she wasn't going to let it go for much longer. Later that week, Margaret had one of her clearer days, the fog lifting just enough to let her sit with Nolan on the porch, while Milo and Camille talked inside. She reached over and took his hand with a grip stronger than her frame suggested. "You're the one who caught me," she said. "No confusion in it this time. No mistaken name. Not the version of you everyone else keeps looking for. You. I want you to remember that, whatever happens next." Nolan didn't understand what she meant until later, when he learned that Sterling, quietly and without board approval, had begun arranging Margaret's transfer to a private care facility outside the city with visitor restrictions strict enough to keep an inconvenient witness from testifying to anything at all. Teresa found the paperwork first, tucked into a folder marked Routine Care Review, and recognized it immediately for what it was. She called Camille that night, voice low, hands shaking as she read the transfer date aloud. 3 days. That was all the time they had before Margaret would be moved somewhere. Sterling controlled the visitor list. Camille sat with the phone against her ear, long after the call ended, staring at the ceiling of her office, calculating what she still needed and how little time remained to gather it. The board meeting Camille called for that Friday was not on anyone's calendar until 40 minutes before it started. She stood at the head of the table with the manila folder open in front of her, Teresa seated to her left, and a man on video call whose face the room hadn't seen in years, the retired inspector, sworn statement ready, voice steady as he described a signature he'd studied under a magnifying glass 3 separate times before concluding it wasn't the same hand that had signed every other document in Nolan Bishop's file. Margaret sat in her honorary chair at the far end of the table, present against Sterling's wishes, Teresa having driven her there directly ahead of the transfer date he'd arranged without anyone's approval. Her presence alone silenced 2 board members who had planned to abstain. "This is character assassination dressed up as due diligence," Sterling said, rising from his chair. "You're trying to protect a man you've clearly grown attached to, Camille, at the expense of this company's reputation." "I'm trying to correct a record you buried, Julian." Sterling turned the attack the only direction he had left. "If anyone falsified that sign-off, it's just as likely Bishop did it himself, trying to cover his own negligence after the fact." That was when Nolan stepped through the boardroom doors, a set of original blueprints under one arm 6 years old, kept in a garage box his son had once found without understanding what he was looking at. "I flagged that scaffolding 3 times before it collapsed," Nolan said, laying the blueprints on the table, his voice even despite the room full of strangers watching him relive the worst year of his life. "Every flag is dated and initialed here, in my own hand, matching every other document I ever signed for this company. Compare it to whatever's stamped on that sign-off. It isn't mine." The room went silent except for the shuffle of paper as board members compared signatures for themselves. Across town, Corey watched the meeting stream on his phone, having found the link through a company insider he still knew from his years hanging around the industry. He watched Nolan speak, steady where Corey himself would have shattered, and felt something in his chest give way that had nothing to do with money. He deleted the reporter's number without a second thought. Back in the boardroom, the vote came fast once the evidence did, 9 votes to 1. The lone dissent belonging to a board member Sterling had cultivated for years, whose objection carried no weight against a forged signature and a sworn statement. Even the 4 members who had once threatened Camille with a no-confidence vote turned on him without hesitation, unwilling to tie their names to a falsified document once it was laid out in front of them. Sterling was suspended on the spot, escorted out under the eyes of people who had once answered to him, his protests trailing behind him down the hallway until the doors closed on them entirely. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, the same steady grip she'd once used on Nolan's wrist on a sidewalk that felt, now, like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. Camille didn't watch him go. She was looking at Nolan, who stood very still amid the noise of a room finally believing him, and for the first time she let her face show exactly what she felt, not pity, not gratitude, but the quiet certainty of someone who had trusted a stranger with her mother's safety and found, underneath everything, a man worth trusting with far more than that. The weeks that followed moved with the strange efficiency of institutions correcting themselves after years of looking away. The board formally terminated Julian Sterling, and referred the falsified sign-off to the district attorney's office, alongside the years-old cover-up of the Platte River collapse. The Whitfield proposal quietly disappeared from the agenda within days, nobody left in the room willing to raise it again. Ashworth Industries issued a public statement, an apology that Camille insisted be specific rather than vague, naming Anna Bishop by name, acknowledging what the company had failed to do 6 years earlier when it mattered most. They offered Nolan his old position back, senior structural engineer, corner office included, along with a settlement large enough to erase every invoice he'd been juggling since the day he missed that interview. He turned down the office. "I don't want the title," he told Camille, the two of them standing in the lobby that had once nearly turned him away at the door. "I want to fix the foundation myself, the stretch out at Platte River, where it happened. Let me finish it the way it should have been finished the first time." She didn't argue with him. She'd learned by then that arguing with Nolan Bishop rarely won you anything except his quiet, immovable respect. Corey sent a text that same week, short and unpolished. The kind of apology that comes without excuses attached. "Sorry for everything I said. Glad the truth got out. Tell Milo I said hi." Nolan read it twice, then let it go, the way he'd let go of most things that no longer served either of them any grief. The transfer paperwork for Margaret's care facility was quietly withdrawn the same afternoon Sterling was escorted out, and Teresa personally tore the folder in half before filing it in the trash, more out of relief than ceremony. Margaret stayed exactly where she was, in the house she knew, on the block where an old woman could still take her walks with someone watching from a distance who cared whether she came home. On the day the Platte River site reopened for repair work, Milo and Margaret came out together, her hand steady in his smaller one as they picked their way across gravel toward the fence line where Nolan worked. Margaret watched him with the particular pride of someone who understood exactly what he was rebuilding, and why it mattered more than any board seat ever could. Camille arrived without an entourage, without her usual schedule of the day trailing behind her, and stood at a distance for a while before Nolan noticed her. He set down his tools and walked over, dust on his hands, the sun low enough to turn the whole site gold. She watched the ease and how he moved through the wreckage of his own worst year, and thought that whatever this was becoming between them, it had never once needed an office title to make it real. By late afternoon, the crew had gone home, and the Platte River site stood quiet except for the water moving past under the new supports, steady where it had once carried the worst day of Nolan's life downstream with it. A small plaque had been set into the concrete near the footpath, simple, unadorned. "In memory of Anna Bishop, who deserved better than silence." Camille found him there alone. The noise of the company, the board, the settlement, all of it left behind somewhere she didn't need to carry into this moment. She came without her usual bearing, without the posture that ran boardrooms, just a woman walking toward a man she'd learned to trust one quiet gesture at a time. "I wanted to say thank you properly," she said. "Not from the company, from me." "You already did that. Weeks ago. A box of pastries, that wasn't properly." She stood beside him, looking out over the water instead of at him, which made it easier somehow to say the rest. "You never asked who my mother was, not once, not even after you found out." "Didn't need to know who she belonged to," Nolan said. "Just needed to know she needed help." Camille looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself in the boardroom or the lobby, or any of the careful rooms where they'd first learned each other's names without learning anything true. Most people would have wanted something for it, eventually. "I got something for it," Nolan said. "Took me a while to notice, but I did." She didn't ask him to explain that. She didn't need to. The distance between them had closed by inches over weeks, never announced, never rushed, until there wasn't much distance left to close at all. Nearby, on a bench overlooking the river, Milo sat with Margaret, her hand resting in his, the two of them quiet in the way people are when words have stopped being necessary. Milo pointed at something drifting past in the current, and Margaret laughed, soft and unhurried, a sound that belonged entirely to this moment and no other. Camille and Nolan stood together without needing to fill the silence with anything more than it already held. No titles between them now, no surface labels, no careful distance kept for the sake of an arrangement neither of them had ever really wanted. Just the river, and the late light, and two people who had found each other by accident and stayed on purpose. He had never asked who the old woman was, and it turned out that was exactly the answer she'd been looking for through every interview of her life.